didn't affect me at all. I never was scared of that.
No?
No,
Okay.
we didn't have to worry about that. Well, I think everybody had a certain concern about that, of course, because it was really scarifying, and the world almost, the world could have come to an end then. We don't know now. We didn't know then what we know now, but it was, really a relatively close call. I can remember thinking, wow, from Cuba to New Orleans, that's not that far for a missile. But we didn't worry. We don't know anybody that thought about trying to go underground or anything like that. Well, now let's see, what was the year? Was it 1960 what? 64?
1962, I
So
think.
1962. So I was 30 years old, and it was in 62, and your mother wasn't born until 65.
Right.
So we had two children, and we later had two more. So we were thinking more about kids than we having our life threatened. There was any fear around here. Sometime around then, tourists, people would come in over on exchange programs, and I remember we were involved in one of those programs, and we took a couple of those Russians to lunch at Antoine's, and that was sort of a feeling, wow, those were maybe bad people, and they had a feeling that they were being followed by the government. They were never really allowed to walk around here without the FBI or somebody really watching them all the time. But there was very little of that. But there was some interchange, there was some exchange of American and Russian citizens. People would fly down, particularly from New Orleans. People would fly down there from here and spend the weekend down there and so forth. I can remember my father and mother going down there probably for an anniversary and had a nice time. So people didn't go there and do they didn't go down there and live like you do at Destin or the like, but they would go down there for a weekend or maybe a week. There was one really nice hotel and there were a bunch of nightclubs. My ship went down there 3 or 4 times in the 50s, and that was Batista was making noises up in the mountains, but I mean, rather Castro was, but Batista was still in charge. But you saw Cuban soldiers all over the Havana waterfront. I was there in the Navy in good times, and that was before Castro. So we saw Havana when it was full of tourists. That's absolutely true. And the most famous American involved with Cuba always was Ernest Hemingway, whom I shook hands with down at his favorite bar with his wife Mary. But you know what was interesting? My old executive officer on my ship that I was on in my day in the Navy, he had command of a destroyer during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Oh, really?
And he went down, his ship went down there, and they escorted one of the ships carrying missiles back out.
Wow.
He really did. It was at the Forest Royal, and he had a big job.
Americans didn't actually know that they were being threatened until day 7 of the 13 days.
Okay.
So what did you think of when everybody found out?
Well, the speech was made, wasn't it, by Adlai Stevenson in the United Nations when he showed photographs of the military bases down there and showed that there were missiles there to launch. There were missile launchers down there that were threatening this country. Well, I don't think there was a hysteria. I can't recall that there was hysteria, but there was a lot of excitement. There's no doubt about it. And here's the ship coming with the missiles themselves, coming to Cuba, and we had to say, you can't bring that ship into Cuba, and they turned back.
Were you upset that the government kept it from Americans for so long?
I don't think people thought that way. I'm not too sure exactly what you mean by that, but I don't think there was too much in the way of secrets that way. Okay. I don't think anybody knew as well as the people around the table how close we came.
Yeah.
That's for sure. But, the government had a spy over in Russia who was telling the government that they will blink, they will not, if you bluff them and say you have to turn back, that they will. They were not going to go to war over this. And I think that encouraged Kennedy to stand up and say you can't go any further.
Do you remember JFK's televised address to the nation?
Not very much. I don't think I do. And you get confused over the years as to whether you really saw it or whether you saw it in a history film or on the reruns. I don't remember sitting around listening to that being discussed, but I do think I remember pictures of Adlai Stevenson making a presentation to the United Nations showing that here are the missile launchers and we've got to get them out of there. And you know, there was one guy particular, I think, in history, one guy who'll go down in history as a guy that really kept something bad from happening, which was the president's brother. As the admirals, the generals were, let's go, let's take them out, we'll go to war. And Kennedy kept saying, Bobby Kennedy kept saying, no, it could be too costly, we can't do it, we've got to try to negotiate or bluff or do whatever. And he stood in the way. He stood up to guys that were really older and much senior to him in experience. Well, I think that's a really good question, but I think there was just sort of a sigh of relief. It happened, and then it was reported the ship turned back.
Right.
And a big sigh of relief. But I don't think everybody was really ready to run into a missile shelter. But that might have been the case in Florida. They were a lot closer to it. You know, from Havana to Key West is about 90 miles. So
Yeah.
I think people in the south of Florida could have been a lot more concerned, but people up here not really. I can imagine, but I don't know any here. Well, you can't build a basement in New Orleans. It's a hard thing to do.
It was more of a sigh of relief when it was over.
Oh, big sigh of relief. I don't think anybody realized how close we had really come to the war. Because had the missiles arrived in Cuba, that doesn't mean they would have been used. But nonetheless, we would have felt much more on the defense that they had a gun at our head all the time. But when those ships turned around, that was really an extraordinary moment. But you weren't following it live on CNN. It wasn't followed as closely as it would be followed today because we didn't have the news gathering facilities.
Right.
You know, it wasn't nonstop 24-hour news. Today, you'd have a camera on that ship the entire time, and you'd see the course plotted over the ocean and so forth. But there was my old executive officer as a commanding officer of a destroyer who was one of the ships that intercepted that ship and said, go back. But it was really an interesting time, wasn't it? And I think 30 years later, the major players from both countries got together, had a nice dinner, had some nice drinks together, and talked about what was going on and how close we came to blowing up the world.